My name is Erin Holmes. I'm the director of the School of Family Life here at BYU, and I want to welcome you to the Virginia L. Cutler Lecture this evening. I want to offer a special welcome to the family and friends of Virginia Cutler, those who were instrumental in setting up the endowment for this Cutler Lecture. And I also want to express gratitude to the friends and family of Dr. Jeremy Pope and Dr. Chris Karpowitz, who will be speaking to us tonight, and those friends and family members who are joining us over Zoom. I also want to offer a warm welcome to our Associate Dean, Jeff Noakes, who is an Associate Dean in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. Thanks for being here, Jeff. And also just offer a warm welcome to all of you who are here tonight. So we'll begin our evening with an invocation by Carly Pope, who is an economics student here at BYU. And then after that, I'll just turn the time directly over to Jay Goodleff. Jay is the chair of the political science department and will be introducing our speakers. And then Jay will turn the time directly over to Chris and Jeremy so we can hear their lecture.
Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to be gathered here today to learn more about family policy. We're so grateful for all the blessings that we've been given and for the opportunity to be here at BYU. Please bless us that we will all be safe and we'll be able to learn a lot tonight. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to this lecture today. It's unusual that we have two people jointly giving this lecture, so I will introduce our speakers individually and then jointly. Professor Christopher Karpowitz received his bachelor's in political science and master's in American studies from BYU. He studied political theory at Duke University and received his master's and PhD in politics from Princeton. Since joining the BYU Political Science Department in 2006, he has published award-winning books on deliberation with Princeton and Cambridge University presses, as well as many articles in the top journals of the discipline. He received the Emerging Scholar Award from the Elections, Public Opinion, and Voting Behavior section of the American Political Science Association and the International Society of Political Psychology's Award for Early Career Achievement. He is currently the Mary Lou Fulton Professor of Political Science at BYU and the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Political Behavior. Professor Jeremy Pope earned an undergraduate degree in economics at BYU and then worked for Norm Ornstein at the American Enterprise Institute. He went on to study political science, receiving his PhD from Stanford University. Since joining the BYU Political Science Department in 2004, he has published books and leading articles on political polarization, elite partisan cues, and the constitutional foundations of America. He is currently a fellow for constitutional government at the Wheatley Institute at BYU and administers the Cooperative Election Survey, a leading national survey in the political science discipline. Together, Professors Karpowitz and Pope served as co-directors of BYU's Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy from 2014 to 2022. They are the co-editors of a forthcoming volume on parties and partisanship. And most importantly for this lecture, Professors Karpowitz and Pope have administered the American Family Survey annually since 2015. Each year, this survey examines the landscape of the family in America, studying the basic structure of the family, current attitudes towards marriage and family, and the perceived role of government policy in relation to the family. In their joint lecture today, we look forward to hearing what they have learned about patterns of family life and what we can do to support families. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chris Karpowitz and Professor Jeremy Pope.
Okay, our title is sort of a mouthful. It's attempting to give you some sense of our findings, or at least the findings we want to talk about today, and the extent to which we see both unity and division in family experiences and in attitudes about the family. As we talk together today, we're going to be drawing on data from the American Family Survey, which was founded in 2015 and has gone on for 10 years. It's an annual survey of 3,000 Americans. On the survey, we typically have a core set of questions that we've asked every year and that we hope to continue to be able to ask. And then we explore individual topics from year to year. We work closely with an advisory board of scholars at various institutions and at the American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institution. We're very grateful for the support over the years from the Deseret News and from the Wheatley Institute. Paul Edwards specifically has been a great support to this project, as well as Allison Pond and now Jason Carroll with the Wheatley Institute. The survey is fielded by YouGov every year. So I want to talk a little bit about red and blue America. We hear a lot of talk about the divisions in our society and about the differences between red and blue perspectives. And I want to talk about those because those differences in perspectives are real. But I also want to draw attention to the extent to which we actually have a great deal in common across boundaries of partisanship. So if we just ask people about their children, for example, turns out red and blue parents love their children. When we ask them whether raising children is one of life's greatest joys, 89% of Democrats agree with that, and 92% of Republicans agree with that. It is very difficult to get Americans to agree about anything at those levels, so that's impressive. It's true that Republicans are more likely to strongly agree than Democrats are, but overall, levels of disagreement with this statement are extremely low. And so people love their kids. Turns out people are pretty happy with their relationships as well. When we ask married couples, and in this case, we're looking at married couples with kids under 18, 88% of Democrats say they're at least somewhat or completely satisfied with their relationships. And 84% of Republicans stay the same. And the numbers are nearly identical if we just include all married couples and not just those with kids. Both Democrats and Republicans report working on their relationship and caring about it enough to talk about it with their partners. So 7 out of 10 Democrats and about the same number of Republicans say that they discuss their relationship with each other at least monthly. One of the things we've been doing over the 10 years of the American Family Survey is to ask people about what families do every day. And so we've come up with a sort of a battery of things that families might do together. And you can see over the course of the 10 years, this is the percentage of respondents each year who say they do these activities at least weekly together as a family. So eating dinner together is pretty common. Watching TV or a movie or playing games together, sort of family activities. Working together is pretty common. Less common, but still done by a meaningful percentage of Americans, is worshiping together or having an argument, going out to movies or museums or attending activities of family members. So our families who are here tonight get credit for that. So that's overall. This is Americans as a whole. Now let's look at Republicans and Democrats. So we'll just look at the 3 activities that were right at the top of the list, right? Eating dinner together. You can see that Democrats and Republicans do that at about the same percentage over the years. It bounces around a little bit, but overall, basically the same for Democratic families and Republican families. Same is true of doing household chores together. Democrats and Republicans report doing this at really high percentages, at least weekly. And that's been true pretty much across the 10 years. True too with family activities at home, watching TV, playing games, watching a movie together. High percentages of American families report doing this at least weekly, and that's been true across the 10 years of the American Family Survey. Are there differences in these activities? And the answer there is yes, and the biggest difference comes in terms of church. So Republicans are just a lot more likely to say that they worship together as a family than Democrats are. Now, for neither group is that a majority who do it every week. But you can see there's a significant gap between Democrats and Republicans. In 2024, that gap was 13 percentage points. So are there differences? Yes. And those primarily revolve around going to church together. And that won't be surprising to political scientists who have thought about the differences in religious attendance between Democrats and Republicans. Well, what about family challenges or family issues? So one of the things we've been doing is asking families, or asking our respondents, what are the biggest challenges that your family faces and the biggest challenges that face families generally? When we ask people to report about the challenges that their particular family faces, we find very few differences between Democrats and Republicans. When we ask people to report, however, the challenges or concerns for families generally in the United States, Democrats and Republicans are really different. So let me give you the evidence for this. And here we did a little survey experiment in which we gave people a curated list of 13 potential challenges that families might face. And we randomly assigned half of our respondents to tell us about the challenges that their particular family faces. And they could choose up to 3 of these. And we randomly assigned the other half to tell us about the challenges they saw for families generally in the United States. And what I want you to see here, let's see, I'll use this pointer. These light circles here in the center are the responses from the set of respondents who were asked about their family. And these numbers indicate the difference between Democrats and Republicans. And you can see that for most of these things, the differences are very small. Democrats are a little more worried than Republicans are about mental or physical health struggles. They're a little more worried about tension between family members. They're also a little more likely to report, Democrats are a little more likely to report arguments between families, between family members. Republicans, on the other hand, are worried about crime and personal safety, and they're really worried about a lack of attendance at church. Now remember, they're responding about their family. So the thing I want you to see most of all is, for most of these things, very little difference between Republicans and Democrats. The story is quite different, however, for the set of respondents who were randomly assigned to respond about families generally in the United States. There you can see the set of concerns that Democrats have, right? Democrats tended to report being much more concerned about physical or mental health struggles, stress on parents, the costs associated with raising a family, finding quality time together, the lack of good jobs and wages. So they're worried about economic stresses. They're worried about mental health and physical health. What are Republicans worried about? Or at least they're more worried about those things than Republicans are when it comes to families generally. What are Republicans more worried about than Democrats? Children growing up without 2 parents in the home, lack of religious faith or church attendance, social media, parents' lack of commitment to each other. So notice, we don't see a real difference in that when asked about families, about their own family, but families generally, we see a much bigger partisan difference. So are there differences? Yes. And we see those coming out when respondents are asked to think about the challenges that families in the United States face beyond their own family. Okay. So we've tried to show you that family life is pretty similar for the most part between Republicans and Democrats, but that doesn't mean there aren't important partisan differences. And one of the places where we see those partisan differences emerging is attitudes about marriage and family. So just as we did with family activities, for the last 10 years, we've been asking respondents every year to tell us how much they agree or disagree with different statements about the family, like marriage makes families better off financially, or marriage is needed to create strong families, or legal marriage is not as important as a personal sense of commitment, or is society better off when more people are married? And you can see that there's, for most of these, a bare majority support for those statements. There's not a whole lot of support for out and out negative statements about families. Marriage is more of a burden than a benefit, or marriage is old-fashioned. But we do see, close to 1 in 5 people saying that that's true. But here again, on these, where we saw earlier very little difference between Republicans and Democrats in their day-to-day reports, in the reports of their day-to-day family activities, here we start to see bigger partisan gaps emerging. So in 2024, for example, Republicans are about 11 percentage points more likely than Democrats to say that marriage makes families and children better off financially. We can say from our data that married folks with kids are better off financially. At least that's what they report to us, and we're not the only ones who have found that. And so we see majorities of both Democrats and Republicans saying that, but there is a gap. That gap gets bigger on these questions like whether marriage is old-fashioned and out of date. Here now we're at 13 percentage points, and you can see that it's still not a majority of either Republicans or Democrats, but there's a big gap there. The gap gets even bigger when we ask whether marriage is needed to create strong families. Now we're talking about 36 percentage point differences, right? 3/4 of Republicans compared to less than half Democrats. And again, on questions like this, is society better off when more people are married? Big gaps emerging between Democrats and Republicans. And that's true when we limit the sample to just married people with children, right? Even among this group, there's a fairly healthy gap. So we've seen similarity in terms of day-to-day family life, but differences in terms of attitudes about family and about marriage. There are also some important differences in whether or not they actually do get married, right? So in our most recent survey, in the 2024 data, about 4 in 10 Democrats said they were currently married, compared to over half of Republicans. And that's not just, you might think, well, maybe that's just an age gap, but it's not a gap. When we control for age in a variety of different ways, that gap remains pretty large, about 10%. So that's sort of the lay of the land in terms of what people are reporting about their home life and what people are reporting in terms of their attitudes about families. Next, Jeremy's going to tell us about policy.
I hope I sound okay. The difficulty of going after Chris is that and I think this contributes to some of our success, is that he's a very positive person. Says positive things and says negative things in a way that makes you feel less bad about them. And I'm a negative person. The way that we were talking about it on the phone earlier today, put it in sort of gospel terms that will be relevant tonight. He's sort of a, bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of people, that sort of thing. And I'm more like the natural man is an enemy to God kind of person. And one of the issues tonight is that I'm going to talk about how the political coalitions, as they're currently constructed, are not necessarily good for families. So I'm going to lean into that sort of negativity a little bit and try to leverage it. And one of the main purposes of this survey is to talk about policies that people like, policies they don't like. What do they think is helping their family? What do they think is not very useful for their family? And so I want to talk about those just a little bit. These are not questions in a time series because we're planning on trying to write something about sort of what did we learn through these 10 years. We asked kind of series of questions about how helpful are these programs for families generally. And this graph tells you the average of how people scored this, running from very unhelpful, unhelpful, neutral, all the way up to very helpful. And these are the programs. I'm not going to run through them or try to characterize them because, to be honest, I was a little bit surprised that there wasn't more variation in what we got. But typically, if you just look at the overall public, they're all right around helpful. There are exceptions. The student loan forgiveness is a little lower. People don't like apprenticeships. People don't like free preschool access. I don't know if I agree with people about those things, but that is what people think. If you divide it up by Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right, you get a little bit more variation. On the other hand, you don't get a ton. Specifically among Democrats, they tend to think that basically everything except apprenticeships are somewhere between helpful and very helpful, pretty much. Private school, a little bit lower. There's more variation among Republicans. I appreciate them as a social scientist for creating variation for me to study one day. But it bounces around a little bit more. Still, they're all pretty much between neutral and helpful. And part of the reason for this, we think, is that people really do think that they could use some help, especially if they're downscale economically. One of the things we've done, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, I'm not going to show you a slide, is ask people about various economic crises. And one of the interesting things that we found was that people were less worried about their personal economic crises during COVID. And the pretty obvious reason for that is that there was a lot of money dropped on people. It was easier for families that were struggling to deal with their various personal crises. But the main point to take away, I think, from these slides is people kind of like most of these programs. Now, we're not here to say these programs are good or bad. That's a different kettle of fish. This is a public opinion survey, so it's just telling us what people think about these programs, and people tend to think they're getting something positive out of most of those programs. And we asked people this particular question, and I want to read it because I want you to think about it a little bit. Many people favor different ways for the government and society to help families. How much would you favor or oppose government spending money to promote each of the following actions to help families, even if it meant paying slightly more in taxes? We asked about a bunch of things, but I want to start with one where I want to be negative again. There's one area where the public is just firmly, unequivocally against the government getting involved, and that is just 23% of the public wants the government to encourage us to have children. Now, that's what we call in political science a low number. Sorry to be sort of technical that way, but in terms of what I'm about to talk about coalitions to support families, I know a lot of people, many of whom are on our board or have helped us in various ways, who are very, I think the term would be pronatal. They want the world to have more kids. They think people aren't having enough kids. Some of them even reach the point of sort of lecturing to a place I wouldn't go. I have some sympathy for the notion that birth rates falling is not necessarily a good thing, but I'll admit I'm kind of in this group that doesn't really want the public to tell these people, stop having dogs in your stroller, move on to having children. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for government to do, and it's not popular with the public. An interesting thing that comes out of this, though, is that when we take this particular question, it is actually true that people are willing to support marriage. But I want to go on a detour before that for just a second. I appreciate Chris letting me go on this detour and not shutting it down earlier, which is to point out, if you need a coalition for something in the United States, the Constitution, American political history, culture, all of those things mean that you have to come up with a coalition that is both sizable and sustained. I like alliteration. You could think of this coalition as being just bigger than a majority, or durable. It has to last across several elections. Now, the last 30 years have been an example of us not building these kinds of coalitions. We don't have these. We don't have sizable coalitions. The Republicans are going to control the House of Representatives by, I think, is it 4 seats or is it 5? 4, it's probably 4. And so that is also not a big number, okay? They don't have a very sizable coalition. And this is just a little table of the last 5 elections to show you that we keep turning over who is in charge of each of these 3 main institutions of government. We don't have coalitions that persist through time. I won't bother putting up the graph that I make all my students in 210 look at about how it's only with the New Deal that we had really large, sizable coalitions that were able to pass political programs. But I think you can have the sense, frankly, going back to the year 1994, we don't have big coalitions. And this is kind of the problem for families. Because there is a lot of support for families, but it manifests itself in different ways, and in ways that I'm going to try to argue to you tonight exhibit a certain kind of partisan blind spot. So I want to take you back. This is going to be some basic social science, like the tables we look at when we first get back the data. And their answers to this question here, the one I just read you a few minutes ago, do you favor or oppose government doing these things? And I picked out a selection of them that I think are representative of the things that we ask people about. Encouraging more two-parent homes, encouraging marriage, more support for education and vocational training, more education for all types of people, spending more on government and community programs, more support to all families. Now, let me point out, this is different than having kids. The government doesn't really, or the people don't want the government to tell us to have kids. They think the government is bad at that and shouldn't do it and should stay out of it. But there's quite a bit more support for encouraging marriage and doing things that help families broadly. Let me just point out a few of them. In the middle here, these educational training kinds of things, these are really popular. So 70% or 74%, like those kinds of things. We're down here spending more on government and community programs. These are high too, a little lower, but not like wildly lower. This is kind of this anodyne statement that is just like, do you like good things happening to people? But that one's pretty popular too. You'll notice here that we've got two up here that are lower. Encouraging more two-parent homes for children and encouraging marriage. And overall, these are still in the range where you could kind of build a coalition to do this, but maybe not a really big coalition, okay? I want to talk about why that is for a second. And it has to do, focusing on these top ones, because of Democrats. They're not as enthusiastic about these things. They don't want the government to encourage marriage. They are less likely to want it to encourage two-parent homes. And I want to say, I think I get this. I think the government might screw this up. The government probably doesn't know what everyone should be doing. Though Chris and I are broadly pro-marriage, there are plenty of marriages that I'm aware of that don't seem like they're going very well, and that people shouldn't be in. So even though we're broadly pro-marriage, I can certainly relate to this idea that some of these things the government might not do well, or we don't trust it, or something like that. And yet I do just want to point out, and I'll come back to this, much of the social science literature suggests that marriage does good things for lots of people. Well, this part, the encouragement, the rhetorical position, the idea that let's just encourage marriage as a culture, Democrats are reluctant there. When we look at Republicans, they're more reluctant on spending. We can get them with our most anodyne statements. Support families, we can get them over 54. But even here, Republicans are the ones who are a little bit uncertain as to whether we should be spending money and programs and things like that. If you think back to that slide a minute ago, they're more reluctant to say those programs are helpful. And again, they may have a point because some of those programs might not work very well. They might not be cost effective. But the trouble we see here is that the coalition to support families, which probably encompasses lots of different types of policies in this area, is kind of broken up. I want to go for a second and look inside of the Democratic and Republican parties to talk about, well, who is it inside of each party that is more in favor of some of these things? Let's do the Democrats first. And I've grayed out everything down here, even though these are the correct numbers, because we're going to focus on the thing that Democrats are reluctant to do. Encouraging more two-parent homes, encouraging marriage generally. If you self-label as a liberal Democrat, you really don't like those things. You think those are bad things. You definitely think the government's going to mess that up in some ways. Who is more sympathetic? Well, Democrats who label themselves moderate, Democrats who are currently married, and most of all, Democrats who go to church. In case anyone is wondering about this, are there any Democrats who go to church? Yes, there are a lot of Democrats who go to church. In fact, if you look at the nationwide number, I didn't get this into the slides in time, I should have put it in there. A third of Americans go to church once or twice a month, or at least report that in our survey. Maybe they're being a little optimistic. The number for Democrats is also a third. So there are lots of Democrats who attend church. And they are more sympathetic to this, I think, because they understand that while you wouldn't want to take this too far, You wouldn't want to get to the point where people are like, get married or else. That's a bad idea. The idea of encouraging rhetorically and coming up with default programs that will help people get married or stay married, they see some value in that. Well, Republicans, the thing they're not really liking to do as much is spending on programs that will help families or just general support. Conservative Republicans are particularly low there. And it's a pretty similar story. Who is it that sees value in these kinds of spending on programs? It's moderate and church attending Republicans who are just much higher than these numbers over here among conservatives. The gap isn't quite as large on these variables as it is among Democrats, but it's still sizable enough. This is the group you're going to have to go to if you want to assemble a coalition. Now, for purposes of keeping this talk short enough so that you don't get too bored, I want to talk for a couple minutes about what Chris and I, after a lot of experience, some of it on the survey, some of it just talking to people in politics and policy, have as their blind spots. I'm going to start with the Democrats, then I'm going to turn to the Republicans. The Democratic blind spot, in my opinion, is to take the position, look, we don't need to encourage two-parent families. The problem with America is we don't have a significant enough welfare state. We don't have programs to support families. Look at that slide that Karpowitz guy put up earlier about all the economic problems that families are facing. That's what we should focus on. I get it. I don't think they're wrong. I think they have a point about that kind of stuff. But I think we would say to them, marriage is good in its own right. Now, again, I don't want to give the impression that we're in favor of everybody getting married. There are people who it didn't work out, or they're not suited for it, and we don't want to force anyone into any situation. And there are certainly marriages that don't turn out well, okay? So we're not trying to make a case that everyone needs to be married. But the social science literature, and you see it in our survey, although I'm just going to assert these things for you tonight, is that marriages help produce lots of good things. More equality, less poverty, better health, educational, and economic outcomes. People who are married tend to score higher on all of these different metrics, and that's good. And marriage does a lot of things Democrats want. Imagine going to Democrats who are concerned about policy vis-a-vis family and saying to them, you know, we've come up with this program. It's going to make America more equal. It's going to help eliminate poverty. It's going to make people more educated and all these wonderful things. They would support that. But if you tell them the program is marriage, they're like, oh, wait, I'm not sure. Should we be encouraging that too much? Except for the church-going Democrats that I was talking to about a minute ago. And I think that's a blind spot. These are some South Carolina Democrats. I just pulled this picture from the internet. And the bias that I think Democrats have is to say, well, let's just go with a kind of stronger welfare state that will fix things. And I think that's a bit of a blind spot. Let's turn to the Republican blind spot. Here I have instead Republicans getting sworn in, but I like to think of them as Republicans being asked the question, should people get married or not? And then we get this, yes, I pledge allegiance to marriage, or something along those lines, okay? I think Republicans have their own blind spot. It's different. Families clearly desire more help with a bunch of things, and I'm not here to pitch one particular program, but I am here to pitch the notion that if you don't make, say, near the median household income wage, you're going to struggle with a lot of things. You're going to feel better about getting help with things like education for your kids, sending them to college, or just paying for school, cost of living, starting a family, a raft of economic troubles, because we find that families who are lower income have a much larger number of economic crises in their life. I think Republicans are very quick to overlook this. And as Chris pointed out, I can't go back to the slide, Democrats aren't getting married as often. And what that means is that if that trend continues, there will be fewer married people in the United States. And by the way, Republicans, don't you want to encourage marriage generally? If you create programs to help deal with this kind of thing, you are more likely to get people interested in marriage. Indeed, I feel like I could go to the Republicans and just make a self-interested case to them and say, hey, married people tend to be Republican. Why aren't you making more married people Republicans? It seems like it's a no-brainer for you. But again, I think that it would be good for society, for Republicans and Democrats to get past their various blind spots. Now, this might be the moment in the lecture where you think we would throw in some sort of church thing. And the obvious church thing, right, is like the family proclamation, and we have an audience here that has a lot of shared commitments about various things. But that's not actually the quotation we agreed upon to put in here. You can go find that on your own. We're going to use one that we think better encapsulates our message for this part of the talk, and it's this one from 2006. Principles compatible with the gospel may be found in the platforms of all major political parties. And the lesson here is, if you really want to build a coalition for families, you're probably going to have to build one that has some uncomfortable alliances, and where people make sacrifices and recognize, oh, my perspective requires me to make deals. Here's a slide that will offend at least some of the strong partisans in the audience in various ways. You have to get people who may strongly favor the welfare state programs that people on the left like to make deals with other people who probably are like open to some of those welfare state programs, but instead of just encouraging families make, cat lady jokes and things like that don't exactly advance the ball on helping families out here. These kinds of uncomfortable programs are, in our view, or coalitions are, in our view, a necessity if we're going to build a truly, fully pro-family coalition. So I want to conclude, and I think we got to talk in a good amount of time because we want to take some questions, and I don't know how we're going to do that. We'll fight over who gets to talk, and the smart thing to do is to play us off for the disagreements. That's the most interesting thing to achieve. We will see if any of you can get a Yahtzee. But let me just conclude by making a few points. Look, both Democrats and Republicans love their families. It does appear that Democrats aren't getting married as often, but family encompasses far more than marriage. And this is a point I try to make to people at all sorts of times. Red and blue families don't really exist because once you get into marriage and just your family relationships generally, we have tried and we are unable to detect big differences in how Democrats and Republicans relate to their families. There are small differences. On worship, there's a difference. There's some other stuff, but it's kind of small potatoes. It's not something that is particularly large. But we do think that both parties have significant blind spots to policies that American families at least say they want and may benefit them, and that we should be thinking hard about whether or not those would be good policies that would benefit them. People are crying out and asking for some kind of assistance here, and smart programs probably would achieve that. Lastly, if we're going to create the kind of coalition that really benefits families, it will mean reaching across party lines in ways that are going to make people sort of uncomfortable. And that's why we left you with that quote about how true principles can be found in both sides of the political spectrum, because we think that is a key principle for understanding families and the effort to build a coalition for families. So thank you very much for listening. We appreciate that. Christy, you want to come up for questions? I'll just put up our last slide. We were told we had to put this thing up here. I think it's so students can get credit for some sort of attending events or something like that. But Chris and I have embedded a subliminal message in it that will teach you to like pro-family policies. It's very subtle. You're not going to feel it. It's just going to be inside of you. Okay? Thank you very much.
About the camera. All right.
Okay.
Here, I'll go over to the other side. You guys go halfway back. Do that camera. So we're happy to take any questions that you might have.
I don't think your mic is on, although I don't know if we're allowed to have both mics on or if that crosses the streams.
Across the stream. Is it turned on in your back? It is. Okay, there's a mute button too. You got it.
Well, anyway, we're happy to take some questions since I'm allowed to talk.
Take the question.
I will answer all the questions.
Will be as soon as you hand it. Please stand.
So I was curious if you noticed any gender divides in any of your questions, particularly about questions where you're asking if people see marriage as equal or have a equal benefit.
I'm going to save one thing that I think Chris will talk about for later when his mic starts to work. I'll start off with the policy side and say, we've looked at a lot of gender differences we've seen fewer than I expected to see. The general pattern on policy, which I know was not your question, but I'm stalling for Chris to get a microphone, is that women tend to be more in favor of programs to help families broadly. And I think that may stem from the fact that there are more single parent women out there who benefit more from those programs than do others. We have done a lot on equality.
Yeah.
And Chris will want to talk about that.
Yeah, so we've asked people in relationships, including married people, how they feel about the division of labor in their homes, for example. And our basic finding there repeatedly over a number of years is that men think they're doing a lot more than women think men are doing. So women tend to say they want the men in their lives to do more, and the men in their lives feel that they are doing a great deal. So there is definitely a divide there. But I will underscore what Jeremy said, that we do find women are more supportive of the kinds of programs we've been talking about that will help the poor or others who are struggling in one way or another.
Can I throw out the 1 year that we threw on the question about children? And
Oh, yes.
I think this is revealing of something. Women think their husbands aren't doing nearly as much as their husbands think. And they also think their children aren't doing very much at home either, which raises the possibility that some of what is going on is that men are lazy, and some of what is going on are that women have incredibly high standards that no one else can meet. So both of those things, I suspect, are true.
Please stand.
This is actually just building off the same question. Was like the flip of the question asked like about men feeling like women do their like enough and like women feel like they're doing enough in the home?
So we just asked both partners, whether it was a man or we don't actually have partners in this survey. So we just have men and women. So we asked them to tell us about how well they share household responsibilities. And men think that they're sharing them 50-50, right? And women do not believe that. They have a much more unequal division of labor, and they feel like they're doing much more of the work.
So you talk about the importance of building coalitions across party lines. And my question is, do you think that there is sufficient wherewithal to be able to sustain that coalition over the long term to be able to produce these sorts of policies?
Not today. I would say no. I'm interested to see how Chris answers this question in a second, but at the moment I would say no. I think a program and a strategy would have to be put together by people that really want to help families, where Democrats would have to make some rhetorical sacrifices and admit and push back against this idea in their own party that they would have to admit that families are good and push back on those people who are want to be very non-judgmental and never say that families can be good, et cetera. Those such people exist. I didn't put them in the slides, and so on and so forth. And Republicans will have to find moderates and church. These programs probably do help a lot of families in the United States, and they feel really good about them. We can have a conversation about whether they're cost effective or what the best version of these programs are. There's a lot of hunger, and until there is a coalition of people willing to push back on the sides in their parties to actually produce that kind of policy, we're not going to get it. I don't know that we're there yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Jeremy's slides about blind spots are exactly right. I think both parties tend to talk past each other, and they insist on their own perspectives on things. I do think Jeremy's right, too, that a lot of what we're seeing on the Democratic side is a very strong desire not to be judgmental of anyone's particular circumstance or anyone's particular life choices. And in one sense, that's a laudable idea, right? I want to be open to the notion that there are different ways of doing things. But I think at times, right, that is undermining support for an institution that really is a great poverty program. If you care about poverty in the United States, you ought to care about families and the health of families in the United States. And so trying to get them to talk to each other, trying to find that common ground between AOC and JD Vance is pretty tough right now. So part of our hope in doing this is to say, there are the seeds, or there is potential for it, but we're not there right now.
Do you see in the data or generally have any concern about the ways in which politicians or parties of a certain party proposing certain policies, pro-family policies, could end up sort of contaminating them in the eyes of the out partisans, right? So if party A says this would be really good for families, then people in party B become suspicious of that. I mean, do you see that? Do you worry about that as part of the prospects for this going forward?
I have a first answer to that question is which, when you win the lottery and fund our planned panel survey over 4 years, that's the first thing we'll study.
We keep pleading for a panel.
Yeah.
It's expensive.
But panels are really expensive, and we haven't done that in quite the way that we would have wished. Having said that, I do basically agree with the intuition underlying your question, which is I think it has to do with the blind spots thing. I don't want to repeat myself too much. I think Republicans here, like, this is a great program. And even though we know for a fact that Republicans are perfectly happy to spend money on all sorts of things all the time, some of which are like truly ludicrous, they push back against this when it's proposed by Democrats. And I assume that's just like partisan warfare. And I think you could probably find a very similar dynamic among Democrats. And it gets to the non-judgmental thing where they're like, JD Vance, when he goes around, because it is offensive to say that, you know, childless cat lady or whatever, thing like that. Yeah, I understand why that's a terrible strategy that he should drop if he really wants families. In a sense, I take him at his word that he does, but I haven't seen the proof in the pudding, and I'm sure he pushes many people on the left away.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Jessica. I think that this is a worry that is real, right? And I think that's part of the hard work we think needs to happen in order to strengthen some of these potential solutions and to create coalitions that are possible but that do not yet exist. I will just point again to something Jeremy said earlier. When we went into COVID and we were looking at the first responses to COVID, we thought, oh my goodness, we've been asking these questions about economic crises. And we thought, we're going to see the biggest spike we've ever seen. And we're going to have, because some years it's 4 in 10 American families have experienced one crisis, at least during the year. A crisis like, I didn't pay all my bills, or I didn't go to the doctor, right, when I needed to because I didn't have enough money, or I needed to stay with someone else, right? These are serious economic challenges. And we thought, wow, if it's 4 in 10 earlier, it's going to be 6 in 10, 7 in 10. It actually went down. And it stayed down for as long as the federal government was giving money to families. And then it went back up again as soon as that ended. And so I think there are actual recent policies that we could point to say, wow, there really is a difference that we can make in the lives of both Republican and Democratic families. And that's a good thing for our nation. Now, as Jeremy said, we can argue about the specifics of any given program or who should administer it, or, you know, those are all sort of normal politics debates. And they occur after there's some effort to try to actually make this coalition.
I would just say, we can't really go back to the COVID thing. It's not a sustainable program.
No.
What we need is actually a sustainable set of programs. that are paid for. And as the debt grows ever larger, I grow ever more despondent that we'll get that. There's a hand way in the, oh, sorry. There is a hand in the back. That's what I was going to say.
That's why we need people sitting. If each of you
Respectively, had all the power in the world and all the power in Congress, what is one policy decision you would change or one piece of legislation you would affect to strengthen the family? What would be the first step?
I would lead with increasing salaries of political science professors.
That's excellent. I'm fully behind that one.
No, I don't know. Do you want to go first or do you want me to go?
Oh, go ahead. I'll take that.
I think there's a pretty strong case to be made, and this is what I would do. People who are lower on the income scale, who as it happens are also the people having kids, need more money at that moment in their life so that they can deal better with the stresses of being married and having kids. So I don't think the government wants us to encourage children, and I'm not saying this to say, oh, let's have a bunch more kids, and if we just had a higher child tax credit so that young families who tend to have fewer resources would find it easier to get through that period of their lives. I doubt that that would make a gigantic difference in terms of how many kids people would have. But I think it would be easier for families to get through that kind of thing. I think it would be good for their kids. I think it'd be good for the marriages because I think it would create somewhat less financial stress. And I would stress that we should be spending more money on people who are further down the income scale, less money on people who are further up the income scale, and that should come early in their lives so that when they're having kids, that could help them. A lot of the institutional programs that we put up there, I have more doubts about whether or not those things actually help families, but I report the data that people say they do, and I doubt they're totally unhelpful. But I think that particular program would mean a lot if you drop money on families at that moment in time. I'm curious what Chris
Yeah, no, we've talked about this, and I think we both agree with each other on. Nobody's done very well at getting us to disagree with each other.
I know how to do it.
We do agree. To me, I go back to the economic crisis findings because it's just clear there's a significant number of people in the United States, families in the United States, who are sort of living on the edge of being okay. And a little bit at the right moment can save them from much greater disaster at the individual and at the family level. And I think we are sometimes, as a community here at BYU, somewhat insensitive to the extent to which families really do live on a knife's edge or a significant percentage, because we live in a place where there's an unbelievable amount of help informally, right? Where if the family in your ward is struggling, there's an entire effort to help that family and to make sure they have what they need. And what is it? And can we help you, in the short term? And how can we help you in the medium and long term? And it's the entire neighborhood here in Utah, given the size of our wards, pitching in together to help those vulnerable families. And it's remarkable, and it's fantastic. But it doesn't occur for many, many families across the United States. And so I think programs that help at those moments where a little bit of help, right? And that could be early on when you're just first having kids and life is difficult and you need a little help, or it could be at those moments when other crises hit, helping people with things like health insurance, for example, making sure they can get the medical care that they need. That is incredibly important. And so strengthening those kinds of programs will make a real difference in the lives of ordinary Americans. And I think that's something we can do. Now, how to do it, how to pay for it is a really important topic. And our public opinion surveys don't tell us very much about that. It just tells us what people say they need.
Yeah.
Time for one more little one at least. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. Jeremy, can't you see way back here? It's Ralph.
I can see you, Ralph.
Okay, good.
If I couldn't see you, I also have the power of hearing.
Okay. Thanks for a very interesting and remarkably concise presentation. And I just have a little question. I just found counterintuitive a pair of findings that you reported, and I wondered if you find it counterintuitive or surprising. That is, I won't remember the numbers, but you pointed out that that most people, I think of both parties, are very negative about government doing things to encourage having children, which
Yes.
seems not hard to understand. People, it seems a very personal thing, and we don't want government involved there. But then on the question of government involvement in encouraging marriage, it was much higher. Did I recall that correctly?
Yes.
Yes.
Kind of surprising. I would think those things would track each other, or what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is interesting, Ralph. There are people on our advisory board who are very gung-ho about government encouraging more children. I think right now, at this moment, that's getting tied up with other debates, such as debates about abortion and those kinds of things. And so I think, at least for some, that's part of what's happening, right? Is that there are other considerations, or they're thinking about those questions in a certain context. But yeah, I mean, I think our finding certainly is that there's much more potential support for the idea that people ought to get married than for the government saying something about the timing or the frequency or the timing or the number of children.
I will simply say that people are short-sighted. And these two things are much more intimately connected than I think you're going to be able to get people to consider on a public opinion survey. So in a sense, I agree with you that it's counterintuitive, because if government is encouraging marriage, we just know based on what happens inside of marriages that would encourage children, right? So that is a very logical outcome. But I think the public separates it in their minds. Perhaps they shouldn't, but I'm a positivist, and apparently they do.
Do you know whether women and men divided in their response on that?
I looked at that. It's very equal. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it was like they were within 5% of one another. It was not big.
We looked for gender divides on a lot of these issues and didn't find it.
There are fewer gender divides in life than you might think, given what gets reported in the media. On the grounds that we should keep this to an hour, is there one last question that is going on? Yeah.
There's been a lot written lately about the demographic winter and the dire consequences that are projected for that. Did you find in your studies an awareness of those issues, or anything that would indicate whether an awareness about those issues would be persuasive as people talk about the kinds of things you presented?
We haven't asked about that specifically. What we have seen over time is an increasing sensitivity to economic challenge. So 10 years ago, economic challenges facing families were not at the top of the list of things people were worried about. It was more cultural and other kinds of things, especially among Republicans. What's happened over time is just increasing concern about economic challenge. That is especially true of Democrats, but it's true, of Americans generally. And so I think part of dealing with that demographic winter, right? If you're worried about people having children and just having more, avoiding this sort of demographic fall off, it's part of the answer is dealing with these economic challenges and making sure that at the moments when they might have children, right, that there is support to do that. They don't want government telling them to have children, but they do want support at the moment when that's relevant to them.
I couldn't really add anything to that. We did, I will say footnote, we did try a few years ago to ask people if they knew facts about things like birth rates
That's
and marriage rates and other things like that, and it was not screaming success. They generally did not know the facts. They didn't care very much about the facts. We didn't get a lot out of that.
Yeah.
So
So
The camera might be better.
Oh, okay, great.
Keep your hands up, Mike.
Perfect. Good. The Virginia Cutler Lecture is an award. It's an honor to give this lecture. So I just have a plaque for both Dr. Pope and for Dr. Karpowitz. So, this is for you, Chris.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
you've got so much to hold.
I do have a lot of things to hold. You're very welcome. So we'll go ahead and let you sit down now. And I just wanted to announce that next year's Cutler Lecture will be awarded to Dr. Lee Johnson in the School of Family Life, a marriage and family therapist who's doing some really fantastic global work on the effectiveness of therapeutic work across the world. So we're excited to hear from him next year. And we'll just end this evening with Jordan Karpowitz, an assistant dean in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, and who also happens to be the wife of Chris, who's giving us our closing prayer. Thank you, Jordan.
Our dear Father in heaven, we're grateful to have been here tonight and to have Professors Karpowitz and Pope share their studies with us and their findings and ideas and thoughts about families and how we can best support families. We're grateful for families, Heavenly Father. We're grateful that we have support for our families, and we're grateful for the things that we learn because we are part of families. Heavenly Father, bless us as we return to our homes this evening, that we'll go in safety, and we're grateful for the opportunities like this to learn and expand our knowledge. And this we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.